The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Marcus first noticed something was wrong with the mirrors in his funeral home. Not wrong in an obvious way, no cracks, no distortions, no supernatural fog creeping across the glass. Just a feeling, a persistent itch at the back of his mind that whispered he wasn't alone when he looked at his reflection. Marcus Holloway had been a mortician for 17 years. He had inherited the Holloway funeral home from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Holloways had prepared the dead for their final rest in this building, a Victorian-era structure that squatted on the corner of Elm and 7th like a patient vulture. The building itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its dark brick facade and tall, narrow windows giving it the appearance of something that had grown from the ground rather than been built upon it. At 42, Marcus had seen everything death had to offer. Car accidents that left bodies barely recognizable. Suicides that painted walls with despair. Natural deaths that seemed peaceful until you noticed the expression frozen on the deceased's face, sometimes serene, sometimes terrified of whatever they had seen in those final moments. He had become numb to it all, or so he thought. The dead were just meat in memory, and his job was to make that meat presentable one last time. But on this particular October evening, as he stood in the embalming room preparing the body of Harold Chen, a 73-year-old retired accountant who had died of a heart attack, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine unease. The embalming room was in the basement, a space that Marcus had kept meticulously clean and organized. Stainless steel tables gleamed under fluorescent lights. Bottles of formaldehyde, cavity fluid, and other chemicals stood in neat rows on shelves. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something organic and ancient that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. It was the smell of death itself. Marcus had decided long ago, a smell that had seeped into the very foundation of the building. Harold Chen lay on the table, his body already pale and waxy. Marcus had removed his clothes and bagged them for the family. Now came the familiar routine, setting the features, preparing the body for preservation, making the dead look as close to sleep as possible. Marcus had done this thousands of times. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, making the small incisions, inserting the tubes, beginning the process of replacing Harold's blood with embalming fluid. That's when he heard it. A footstep on the stairs leading down to the basement. Marcus froze, his hand still on Harold's arm. The funeral home was closed. He had locked all the doors himself. He was alone. The footstep came again, slow, deliberate, the old wooden stairs creaking under weight. Marcus's heart began to pound. He reached for his phone, but it was upstairs in his office. The nearest weapon was a scalpel on the instrument tray, and he grabbed it, feeling foolish even as he did so. What was he going to do? Fight off an intruder with a tool meant for cutting dead flesh? The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Marcus turned toward the door, his mouth dry, his knuckles white around the scalpel handle. Nothing. No one stood in the doorway. The basement was empty, except for Marcus and Harold's corpse. Marcus waited, listening. The rain drummed against the high basement windows. The fluorescent lights hummed. His own breathing sounded thunderous in his ears. After 5 minutes, he forced himself to move. He checked the stairs, the storage rooms, the small bathroom tucked into the corner. Empty. All empty. He must have imagined it, he told himself. Or perhaps the old building was settling, the wood expanding and contracting with the rain and temperature changes. But he knew the sounds of this building. He had worked here his entire adult life. He knew which stairs creaked and which ones didn't, and those footsteps had been real. Marcus returned to Harold's body, trying to shake off the unease. He needed to finish the embalming tonight, so the viewing could happen tomorrow as scheduled. The family was coming at 10 in the morning. He was suturing the incision on Harold's neck when he noticed Harold's eyes were open. That was impossible. Marcus had closed them himself, had even used eye caps to keep them shut. But now they stared at the ceiling, glassy and unfocused. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he reached out to close them again. As his fingers touched Harold's eyelids, he could have sworn no. He must have imagined it, that Harold's eyes shifted. Just a fraction. Just enough to look directly at him. The scalpel clattered to the floor. Marcus stepped back, his breath coming in short gasps. This was ridiculous. Dead people didn't move. Their eyes didn't shift. It was just gas escaping from the body, muscles contracting, perfectly natural post-mortem processes. He had learned all of this in mortuary school. He knew the science. But science didn't explain why Harold's mouth had curved into something that almost looked like a smile. Marcus left the embalming room. He left it quickly, without looking back, and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. He found himself in the main parlor, a room decorated in deep burgundy and gold, with heavy curtains and dark wood furniture that was meant to look dignified and comforting. Right now, in the dim security lighting, it looked like a stage set for a gothic horror story. He went to his office and grabbed his phone with shaking hands. He considered calling someone, but who? The police. And tell them what exactly? That a corpse had smiled at him? That he had heard footsteps when he was alone? They would think he was crazy. He was beginning to think he was crazy. Marcus poured himself a whiskey from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer. He wasn't supposed to drink on the job, but tonight he needed it. The amber liquid burned going down, but it steadied his nerves. He looked at the calendar on his wall. October 27th. 3 days until Halloween. Maybe that was it. The season was getting to him, all the decorations and horror movie marathons, and talk of ghosts and ghouls. His mind was playing tricks on him, but he had seen Harold's eyes move. He was sure of it. Marcus forced himself to go back downstairs. He had a job to finish. Harold's family was counting on him. He couldn't let his imagination interfere with his responsibilities. The embalming room looked exactly as he had left it. Harold lay on the table, eyes closed now, mouth set in a neutral expression. The scalpel was still on the floor where Marcus had dropped it. Everything was normal. Marcus picked up the scalpel, cleaned it, and returned to his work. He moved quickly, efficiently, trying not to think about what he had seen or thought he had seen. Within an hour, the embalming was complete. He dressed Harold in the suit his family had provided, positioned him in the casket they had selected, and wheeled him into the viewing room. Harold looked peaceful, natural, like he was sleeping. Marcus had done good work. He cleaned the embalming room, sterilizing the instruments, mopping the floor, ensuring everything was ready for the next client. By the time he finished, it was nearly midnight. The rain had finally stopped, and the silence was somehow worse than the constant drumming. Marcus locked up and went home to his small apartment above a Chinese restaurant 3 blocks away. He had inherited the funeral home, but not the family home where he had grown up. His mother had sold that years ago, after his father's death, before moving to Florida to live with Marcus's sister. Marcus had thought about living at the funeral home itself. There were upstairs apartments that previous generations of Holloways had occupied, but he had never felt comfortable with the idea. He liked having separation between his work and his home life. Tonight, though, even his apartment didn't feel safe. He kept thinking about Harold's eyes, the way they had seemed to focus on him, to see him despite being dead. He drank another whiskey and tried to sleep, but when he closed his eyes, he saw corpses staring back at him, their mouths twisted in knowing smiles. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Marcus arrived at the funeral home at 8 to do a final check before the Chen family arrived for the viewing. He found Harold exactly as he had left him, looking peaceful in his casket. Everything was in order. The viewing went well. Harold's wife wept quietly. His children stood solemn and red-eyed. His grandchildren looked confused and frightened, the way children always did when confronted with death. Marcus moved among them with practiced sympathy, offering tissues, murmuring condolences, ensuring everyone had what they needed. By noon, the viewing was over. The family had gone, and the funeral was scheduled for the following day. Marcus had a few hours before his next appointment, a meeting with the Ramirez family to discuss arrangements for their mother, who had died the previous day in hospice care. He went to his office to catch up on paperwork. Death generated an enormous amount of paperwork: death certificates, insurance forms, permits, contracts. Marcus had always been meticulous about documentation. It was one of the things that had made Holloway Funeral Home successful over the years. People trusted him to handle not just their loved ones' bodies, but all the bureaucratic details that came with death. He was reviewing a contract when he heard the front door open. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes people stopped by without appointments, wanting to pre-plan their funerals or ask questions about services. Marcus rose from his desk and went to the front parlor. Harold Chen stood in the entryway, water dripping from his suit. Marcus's brain couldn't process what he was seeing. It simply refused. Harold was dead. Harold was in a casket in the viewing room. Harold could not be standing in front of him, soaking wet, staring at him with those same glassy eyes Marcus had closed and reclosed last night. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His legs felt weak. The room tilted slightly. Harold took a step forward. Water squelched in his shoes. His skin had the gray, waxy quality of embalmed flesh, but he was moving. He was walking. Marcus backed up, his hands groping behind him for support. His mind screamed that this was impossible, that dead people didn't walk, that he was having some kind of breakdown, that the stress of the job had finally caught up with him after all these years. Harold opened his mouth. Water dribbled out, along with something darker. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like gravel scraping against concrete, like air being forced through a throat that no longer worked properly. But Marcus had already fled. He ran through the funeral home, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and didn't stop until he was outside, standing in the cold October air, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked back at the building. Through the window, he could see the front parlor. It was empty. Marcus pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called Dr. Patricia Morrison, his therapist. He had seen her for a few months after his father's death, when the weight of taking over the family business had felt overwhelming. He hadn't talked to her in 5 years, but her number was still in his phone. She didn't answer. He left a rambling message about stress and hallucinations, and needing an appointment as soon as possible. Then he forced himself to go back inside. He had to go back inside. He had a business to run. The Ramirez family would be here in an hour. The viewing room looked undisturbed. Harold lay in his casket, exactly as he should be. Marcus approached slowly, half expecting Harold to sit up, to grab him with cold, dead hands. But Harold remained still and peaceful. Marcus checked the body carefully. The suit was dry. There was no water anywhere. Harold hadn't moved. Harold couldn't have moved. Dead people didn't walk out of their caskets, wander around funeral homes, and then climb back in. He had imagined it. He must have imagined it. The stress, the long hours, the season, it was all getting to him. He needed a vacation. He needed therapy. He needed to get his head straight. The meeting with the Ramirez family went smoothly. Isabella Ramirez had been 91, and her death had been expected. Her children were sad but composed, already moving through the stages of grief toward acceptance. They selected a modest casket and a small ceremony. Marcus took notes, made suggestions, and handled everything with the professional compassion that had become second nature to him. After they left, Marcus went down to the basement to collect Isabella's body from the cooler where the hospice had delivered it that morning. The cooler was a recent addition, installed 5 years ago to replace the old one that had finally given up after decades of service. It could hold up to 4 bodies, though Marcus rarely had more than 2 at a time. He opened the cooler door and froze. There were 3 bodies inside. Isabella Ramirez was there, tagged and waiting. But there were 2 others. Marcus recognized them both. Samuel Pierce, whom he had buried 2 weeks ago, and Margaret Holloway, his own grandmother, whom he had embalmed and buried 7 years ago. They lay on the cold metal shelves, their skin gray and mottled. their eyes open and staring at nothing. Or staring at him. Marcus slammed the cooler door shut. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. He had buried Samuel Pierce himself. He had watched the casket lowered into the ground. His grandmother had been dead for 7 years. He had scattered rose petals on her casket before they covered it with earth. He was losing his mind. That was the only explanation. 17 years of working with the dead had finally broken something in his brain, and now he was seeing things that weren't there, couldn't be there. Marcus ran upstairs and grabbed his car keys. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of this building before he completely lost his grip on reality. He would call Dr. Morrison again. He would check himself into a hospital if necessary. But he couldn't stay here. He made it to the parking lot before he realized he couldn't just leave. Isabella's body needed to be prepared. The Chen funeral was tomorrow. He had responsibilities. People were counting on him. Marcus sat in his car for 20 minutes, trying to calm down, trying to think rationally. Dead people did not come back. They did not climb out of their graves and return to the place where they had been prepared for burial. What he was experiencing was a psychological break, nothing more. If he went to a hospital now, they would medicate him, possibly institutionalize him. His business would suffer. His reputation would be destroyed. He needed to push through this. He needed to finish his work, and then he would seek help. Just a few more hours. He could manage for a few more hours. Marcus returned to the basement. He opened the cooler quickly, before he could lose his nerve. Isabella was there, alone, as she should be. No Samuel Pierce, no grandmother. Just Isabella Ramirez, an old woman who had died peacefully in her sleep. He wheeled her out and began the embalming process, focusing on the familiar steps, the routine that he could perform almost without thinking. Drain the blood. Inject the embalming fluid. Set the features. Prepare the body for viewing. But his hands shook. He made small mistakes, things he never did, a slightly uneven suture, too much glue on one eyelid. Nothing the family would notice, but Marcus noticed. Marcus always noticed. As he worked, he became aware of a presence in the room. Not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling that he was being watched. He glanced at the corners of the basement, at the shadows that the fluorescent lights couldn't quite reach. Nothing moved, nothing was there, but the feeling persisted. Marcus finished his work as quickly as he could and wheeled Isabella to the viewing room. He dressed her in the lavender dress her family had brought, applied makeup to give her skin some semblance of life, and positioned her hands in a peaceful fold across her chest. She looked good, natural, at rest. It was past 9 when he finally finished cleaning up. The funeral home was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration unit and the occasional groan of old pipes. Marcus locked up and went home, exhausted and rattled. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cooler opening to reveal more bodies, an endless procession of the dead he had prepared over the years, all of them staring at him with knowing eyes. The Chen funeral the next day was a blur. Marcus moved through it mechanically, greeting mourners, managing the ceremony, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Harold looked peaceful in his casket. The family seemed satisfied. No one noticed that Marcus was falling apart. After the funeral, after Harold's casket had been lowered into the ground and the mourners had dispersed, Marcus sat in his office and stared at nothing. He needed help. He knew that now. Whatever was happening to him, hallucinations, delusions, a complete psychotic break, it was beyond his ability to manage alone. He was reaching for his phone when he heard it again. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, coming up from the basement. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't move. He sat frozen in his chair as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, crossed the hall, and approached his office. Harold Chen peered in the doorway. He was still wearing his funeral suit, but now it was stained with earth. Dirt clung to his hair and face. His eyes, those terrible glassy eyes, fixed on Marcus. Behind Harold, others emerged from the hallway. Samuel Pierce, still in the suit Marcus had dressed him in 2 weeks ago. Margaret Holloway, wearing the blue dress Marcus had selected for her funeral, and more, so many more. Faces Marcus recognized from recent funerals and faces from years past, all of them dead, all of them walking. They filed into the office, filling the small space surrounding Marcus's desk. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything. Marcus's mind finally snapped. He started laughing, a high, desperate sound that didn't seem to come from him. This was it. This was the end of his sanity. He had finally crossed the line between the living and the dead, and he couldn't find his way back. The dead stared at him, waiting. Marcus's laughter died in his throat. In the sudden silence, he heard something else, a whisper. It seemed to come from all of them at once, a chorus of voices that had no right to speak. They were showing him something, memories, not his memories, but theirs. Marcus saw himself in their memories, saw himself from their perspective. He saw his hands on their bodies, preparing them, positioning them, making them presentable. But he saw something else too. He saw the shortcuts he had taken, the corners he had cut, the cheaper embalming fluid he had started using 3 years ago to increase his profit margins, the rushed preparations when he was tired or stressed, the bodies he had treated not with dignity, but with contempt, rushing through the process because he had stopped caring, stopped seeing them as people who deserved respect even in death. He saw Harold Chen on the embalming table. In Harold's memory, Marcus's hands were rough and patient. Marcus had been annoyed that the embalming was taking so long, that Harold's veins were difficult to access. In his irritation, he had made crude comments under his breath, had handled the body without the care that the Chun family had paid for and deserved. He saw Samuel Pierce. Marcus had been hung over the day he prepared Samuel, and he had done a sloppy job, covering up his mistakes with extra makeup and positioning. He saw his grandmother. Marcus had been so consumed with grief and the stress of taking over the funeral home that he had rushed through her preparation, had failed to give her the meticulous care she had given to his grandfather when she had helped Marcus's father prepare him for burial. The memories kept coming, a cascade of his failures, his disrespect, his treating of the dead as objects rather than as people who had lived and loved and deserved dignity in their final presentation. The dead were not here to haunt him, Marcus realized. They were here to hold him accountable. Marcus fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face. He had spent 17 years believing he was providing a service, believing he was good at his job, never realizing that he had become callous, that he had forgotten the sacred nature of what he did. The dead watched him cry. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched. Marcus didn't know how long he knelt there. Eventually, he became aware that the office was empty again. The dead had gone, vanished as impossibly as they had appeared. But he could still feel them. They were in the building, in the walls, in the very air he breathed. They had always been there, he realized. He had just stopped noticing them. Marcus stood on shaky legs. He looked around his office, seeing it with new eyes. The expensive furniture, the certificates on the walls, the awards for service excellence, it all seemed like a mockery now. He had won awards for how many funerals he had conducted, for his business success, for customer satisfaction. But he had lost sight of what mattered. He went down to the basement. The embalming room was empty, but he could sense them there, the thousands of dead who had passed through this space. He had started this job with reverence, with a desire to honor the dead and comfort the living. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that. Death had become routine. The bodies had become problems to solve rather than people to serve. Marcus made a decision. He would change. He had to change. He would go back to the beginning. Remember why his grandfather had started this business, why his father had continued it. Not for profit, not for success, but to provide dignity to those who could no longer speak for themselves. He spent that night in the funeral home, going through his records, reviewing every funeral he had conducted over the past 5 years. He made a list of the ones he knew he had rushed, the ones where he had cut corners. It was a long list. Too long. Over the following weeks, Marcus transformed his practice. He switched back to premium embalming supplies, even though they cost more. He started spending more time with each body, treating each preparation as if it were for his own family member. He installed better lighting in the embalming room. He began playing soft music while he worked, something his grandfather used to do. He also started talking to the bodies. Not in a crazy way, but quietly, respectfully. He would tell them what he was doing, explain each step of the process. He would learn about them from their families and share that information while he worked, treating them as the individuals they had been. The dead stopped visiting him. Or rather, they stopped appearing in his waking hours, but Marcus felt their presence constantly. He felt them watching, judging, ensuring he kept his promise. His business actually improved. Families noticed the difference, the extra care he took. Referrals increased. But Marcus barely noticed the business side anymore. He focused solely on the work, on honoring each person who came through his doors. 3 months after Harold Chen's first visit, Marcus was preparing the body of an elderly woman named Rose Martinez. She had died of cancer, and the disease had ravaged her body. It would be a challenging preparation, requiring extra care to make her look peaceful for her family. Marcus worked slowly, carefully, talking to Rose as he went. He told her about the flowers her grandchildren had selected for the funeral, about the beautiful eulogy her son had written. He took his time, ensuring every detail was perfect. As he positioned her hands, he felt a warmth spread through the room. Not physical warmth, but something else, a sense of approval, of peace. Marcus looked up and saw her standing in the corner of the embalming room. Not Rose, she still lay on the table in front of him, but a presence, a figure he couldn't quite make out. It could have been his grandmother. It could have been Harold Chen. It could have been any of the dead who had visited him that October night. The figure nodded once, and then it was gone. Marcus understood. This was the standard he needed to maintain. Everybody, every time. No exceptions. He kept his promise. Years passed, and Marcus became known as one of the most meticulous morticians in the state. He trained assistants, teaching them not just the technical skills, but the philosophy behind the work. Every body was a sacred trust. Every preparation was an act of service and dignity. He never saw the dead again in the way he had that October, but he felt them. In quiet moments, between one breath and the next, he would sense their presence. They were watching, ensuring he remembered. And Marcus was grateful. They had given him a gift, those visitors. They had reminded him of what was important, pulled him back from the edge of cynicism and burnout. They had saved him from becoming a machine, had reminded him that even in death, people deserve to be treated as people. On the anniversary of Harold Chen's first visit, Marcus stood in the embalming room after finishing his work for the day. The room was clean and quiet. He raised a glass of good whiskey this time, not the cheap stuff he used to drink. He spoke aloud, though he was alone. He thanked them, all of them, for coming back, for showing him what he had become and giving him a chance to be better. The room remained silent, but Marcus felt the acknowledgement. They had heard him. He finished his whiskey, cleaned the glass, and turned off the lights. As he climbed the stairs from the basement, he could have sworn he heard footsteps behind him, not menacing, not frightening, just present. Marcus smiled. He wasn't alone in this building. He never had been. And that was exactly as it should be. The dead deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be honored. And they deserve to be present, even if the living couldn't always see them. Marcus Holloway had finally learned what his grandfather and father had always known. The dead were not just bodies to be prepared and buried. They were witnesses to the care we take with those who can no longer care for themselves. They were reminders that how we treat the dead reflects who we are as human beings. And sometimes, when necessary, they came back to teach us that lesson. Marcus locked up the funeral home and walked home through the October night. The air was cold, and leaves skittered across the sidewalk. Halloween was approaching again, the season when the barrier between the living and the dead was said to be thinnest. Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. He welcomed it. In his apartment, Marcus poured another small whiskey and sat by the window, watching the street below. He thought about Harold Chen, about his grandmother, about all the others who had returned to show him the error of his ways. He thought about Rose Martinez, lying peaceful and dignified in her casket, ready for her family to say goodbye. He thought about the work still to come, the bodies still to be prepared with the care and respect they deserved. And he thought about the watchers, the dead who never truly left, who observed from wherever they resided, ensuring that their final rest would be honored. Marcus raised his glass to the window, to the night, to the unseen presences that filled the world. The whiskey went down smooth. Outside, the October wind whispered through the trees. And somewhere, in the space between the living and the dead, Marcus felt the watchers nod in approval. He had learned his lesson well. The dead would make sure he never forgot it. In the months that followed, Marcus's transformation became complete. He started a journal, documenting not just the technical details of each preparation, but the stories of the people he served. He learned about their lives from their families, their hopes and dreams and accomplishments. He wrote it all down, creating a record that went beyond mere death certificates and embalming reports. Mrs. Patricia Wong had been a concert pianist. Her hands, though aged and arthritis gnarled, had once flown across keyboards in concert halls around the world. Marcus took special care with her hands, positioning them as if she were about to begin a performance. Thomas Bradley had been a Marine in Vietnam. His body bore the scars of that service, including a prosthetic leg. Marcus ensured that Thomas was dressed in his uniform, that every medal was placed precisely according to military regulations, that his final appearance honored his service. 7-year-old Emma Richardson had died in a car accident. The hardest cases were always the children. Marcus worked on Emma with tears in his eyes, talking to her softly, telling her about the stuffed rabbit her parents wanted buried with her, about the drawings her classmates had made. He made sure she looked peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping, so her parents could have one last gentle memory. Each person who came through Holloway Funeral Home received Marcus's complete attention and care. No detail was too small. No request was too difficult. He had staff, now 2 assistants who he trained personally, instilling in them the same philosophy that his midnight visitors had taught him. But Marcus still did most of the preparations himself. It was his penance and his purpose. The funeral home became a place where families felt their loved ones were truly honored. Word spread. Marcus received calls from across the state, from families who wanted their loved ones to receive the Holloway treatment. He could have expanded, opened additional locations, turned it into a chain. But he refused. That wasn't the point. The point was the work itself, the sacred task of honoring the dead. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus would walk through the funeral home, checking on the bodies awaiting burial. He would stop by each casket, making small adjustments, straightening a collar, smoothing hair, ensuring everything was perfect. And sometimes he would feel them there, the watchers, the ones who had come back to teach him. They never manifested the way they had that first time. There were no more dramatic appearances, no more confrontations. But Marcus would catch glimpses of them in mirrors, shadows that didn't quite match their sources. He would hear footsteps when he was alone. He would feel the temperature drop in certain rooms at certain times. Rather than fear these signs, Marcus welcomed them. They meant he was being observed, that his work was being evaluated by the ultimate judges, those who had experienced it themselves. On the 5-year anniversary of Harold Chen's visit, Marcus held a private ceremony in the funeral home. He lit candles in each viewing room and in the embalming room. He spoke aloud, addressing the dead who he knew were listening. He thanked them again for their intervention. He promised to continue honoring them, everyone who came through his doors. He acknowledged that he would someday join them, and he hoped that when that day came, they would judge him worthy of the same care he now provided. The candles flickered, though there was no breeze. Marcus felt a warmth, that same sense of approval he had felt while preparing Rose Martinez. He was on the right path. The watchers were satisfied, but Marcus knew he could never become complacent. The moment he started cutting corners again, the moment he began treating the dead as mere objects, they would return. And next time, he suspected, they would not be so forgiving. So Marcus maintained his vigil. Every body received the same meticulous care. Every family received the same compassionate service. Every funeral was conducted with the same dignity. His assistants noticed his dedication and mirrored it. The Holloway Funeral Home became known not just for quality service, but for something more, a sense that the dead were truly respected there, that they were not just processed but honored. Years passed. Marcus's hair grayed. His hands, though still steady, developed arthritis. He knew that someday he would need to retire, to pass the business to someone else. He had no children, no family to inherit. But he had his assistants, trained in his methods, committed to his philosophy. On a cold January morning, 10 years after Harold Chen's first visit, Marcus was preparing the body of an elderly man named Robert Sullivan. Robert had been a teacher, beloved by generations of students. His funeral would be large, with hundreds of people expected to attend. Marcus worked with his usual care, but he felt tired. The arthritis in his hands made the delicate work more difficult. He had to stop frequently to rest, to stretch his aching fingers. As he positioned Robert's hands, Marcus suddenly felt dizzy. The room tilted. He reached for the embalming table to steady himself, but his legs wouldn't support him. Marcus collapsed. He lay on the cold floor of the embalming room, unable to move, his heart hammering irregularly in his chest. A heart attack, some distant part of his mind recognized. A massive one. He tried to call for help, but his assistants had gone to lunch. The funeral home was empty except for Marcus and Robert's body. As his vision darkened, Marcus saw them. They emerged from the shadows, filling the embalming room. Harold Chen, Samuel Pierce, his grandmother, Rose Martinez, all the others he had prepared over the years. They stood in a circle around him, looking down at his dying body. Marcus wasn't afraid. He had lived the past 10 years preparing for this moment. He had done the work. He had honored them. Now it was his turn to join them. The watchers parted, and through the gap, Marcus saw a new figure. His father, dressed in the same suit Marcus had buried him in 15 years ago. His father smiled and extended a hand. Marcus reached up with his last strength. His fingers brushed his father's, and warmth flooded through him. His father spoke, though Marcus heard the words in his mind rather than his ears. His father told him he had done well. He had learned the lesson. He had redeemed himself and honored the Holloway legacy. Now it was time to rest. Marcus's vision faded completely. His last thought was one of gratitude, that he had been given a second chance, that he had learned to see the dead not as bodies, but as people deserving of dignity and care. The watchers remained with him as he died, bearing witness as he had borne witness to so many others. When it was over, they vanished, returning to wherever they resided. Marcus's assistant found him an hour later. The young man called 911, but it was far too late. Marcus had been dead for some time. The assistant also noticed something strange. Robert Sullivan's body had been moved from the embalming table to one of the cooler shelves, positioned with careful dignity. The embalming process had been completed, perfectly completed, every detail attended to, but that was impossible. Marcus had collapsed before finishing the work. The assistant stared at Robert's body, then at Marcus's still form on the floor. Slowly, a chill ran down his spine. He had heard the stories about this place, the whispers among the staff about footsteps when no one was there, about shadows that moved independently, about the sense of being watched. He had dismissed them as superstition. But now, looking at the completed work that couldn't have been completed, he wondered. The assistant made his phone calls to the police, to Marcus's lawyer, to the families who had funerals scheduled. He managed the immediate crisis with the competence Marcus had trained into him. But that night, when he came back to close up the funeral home, he found himself drawn to the embalming room. He stood in the doorway, looking at the space where Marcus had died. And he felt them. The presences that Marcus had lived with for 10 years, the Watchers. They were still there, observing, ensuring that the work continued with the dignity it deserved. The assistant made a decision. He would continue Marcus's work. He would maintain the standards, honor the dead, provide the care that the Holloway funeral home had become known for. As if in response to his silent vow, the assistant felt a warmth spread through the room, a sense of approval. The Watchers had accepted him. The assistant closed up the funeral home and went home. The next day, he would prepare Marcus's body himself. He would give his mentor the same meticulous care that Marcus had given to thousands of others. And he would do it knowing that Marcus was watching now, had joined the Watchers, would ensure that the Holloway legacy continued. The dead never truly left. They remained, observing, holding the living accountable for how we treat those who can no longer speak for themselves. It was a burden and a blessing. The assistant understood that now, as Marcus had understood it for the past 10 years, as the Holloways had understood it for 3 generations. The work would continue. The Watchers would ensure it. And someday, when the assistant's time came, he too would join them, bearing witness to those who came after. It was the way of things. It was the price of working with the dead. It was the sacred trust that bound the living to those who had passed. And in the Holloway funeral home, on the corner of Elm and 7th, that trust would never be broken. The Watchers would make sure of it.